Mrs. Grimm looked over, saw Mayor Charming, and quickly came to join them. "Good morning, Mayor. I see you've met my granddaughters. How goes the fundraiser planning? It's in a couple of days, correct?" "It is not a fundraiser," Charming bellowed, then took a deep breath to calm himself. "It's a ball, and it's tomorrow. Yes, I should be overseeing the final details, but unfortunately I am required to investigate every little stray cloud. As I suspected, there's nothing out here but a broken house. I don't know what the farmer expected with such shoddy workmanship. He's lucky to have crawled out alive." Sabrina was stunned. He was right. The pile of debris was the remains of a house. Sabrina saw pieces of furniture and clothing sticking out of the pile, an old Afghan quilt swinging from a stick in the breeze. What in the world had happened? "So there was a survivor," Mrs. Grimm said, writing in her notebook. "Girls, we've got ourselves a bona fide mystery." "Here she goes, Mr. Seven, Rhoda Grimm, private eye, out to solve the case that never was," the mayor said. "See, that's the problem with you Grimms. You can never quite grasp that in order to solve a mystery, there must be a mystery. A farmer built a flimsy house and it fell down. It was an accident. Case closed." "Then why do you call it a crime scene?" Sabrina piped up. Charming turned and shot her a look that could have burned a hole through her. "You must have misheard me, child," he said between gritted teeth. "Mr. Seven, take down this note, please. New law. Children should not ask questions of their elders." "I heard you say it too," Daphne said. As the little man scribbled furiously in his notebook, Mrs. Grimm said, "We both know why we're here, Mayor." Charming tugged on his necktie and adjusted his collar. "This is none of your concern, Rhoda." "You know it is, William," Mrs. Grimm said. Just then Mr. Kenneth approached. Charming shook his head in disgust at the sight of him. "Well, if it isn't the big bad William!" said Mrs. Grimm angrily. "Oh, did I say too much?" Charming said to Kenneth with a wicked grin, then leaned in close to the girls. "Do yourselves a favor, kids. Check Granny's teeth before you give her a good-night kiss." "Do you think it's wise to provoke me?" Mr. Kenneth said as he took a step toward the mayor. Despite the old man's skinny frame and watery eyes, his words seemed to unnerve Charming. "That's enough!" Mrs. Grimm demanded. Her impatient tone shocked the girls, but the effect on the two grown men was even more startling. They backed away from each other like two schoolboys caught fighting on the playground. "The dog has found something," Mr. Kenneth said gruffly. He placed an enormous green leaf in Mrs. Grimm's hand. It was nearly as wide as a suitcase, and the old woman's eyes lit up with wonder. "Well, look at that, Miss Mayor Charming. I think we've found a clue. There might be a mystery to solve here yet," she said. "Congratulations! You found a leaf in the middle of all these trees," Charming scoffed. "I bet if you keep looking, you might find a twig or even an acorn." "You don't see a lot of beanstalk leaves in this part of the country," the old woman replied. "Listen, Rhoda, stop meddling in our affairs or you're going to regret it," said the mayor. "If you don't want me meddling, then you must really do a better job of covering up your mistakes." Mrs. Grimm placed the leaf in Mayor Charming's hand. The mayor tore it into a dozen pieces and tossed it into the air, then turned to Mr. Seven. "Get the door, you lumpy bag of foolishness!" he shouted. The little man nearly lost his paper hand as he rushed to the car door. Within moments, they were gone. The limo spat gravel behind it as it drove away. "Girls, why don't we take a walk over to that hill and sit by that tractor? I'd like to see this sight from above," Mrs. Grimm said. Daphne took the old woman's hand and helped her up the slope to where the lonely tractor was parked. Sabrina followed. When they reached the top, the old woman plopped on the ground and caught her breath. "Thank you, Liebling. Either the hills are getting steeper or I'm getting older." "Who's that man?" Daphne asked. "Let's just say he's a royal pain," Mrs. Grimm replied. "Mr. Charming is the mayor of Fairyport Landing." "What's with the bad attitude?" Sabrina asked. The mayor reminded her of the orphanage's lunch lady, who seemed to delight in telling the children they were getting fat. "He can be a little grumpy," Mrs. Grimm agreed. "He and Mr. Kent sure don't like each other," Daphne added. "They have a long history," the old woman said as she stooped to pick a small black disc off the ground. How interesting. A lens cap from what looks like a very expensive video camera. She dropped it into her handbag and happily jotted down another note in her notebook. It's probably junk, Sabrina said. Maybe, Mrs. Grimm said. Still, it could be a clue. A good detective is always looking for something other people don't see. That one thing that looks out of place. For instance, look at all the rubbish down there. Do you see anything that doesn't fit? All I see is a house that fell down, Daphne replied. The mayor's theory is one explanation, but think bigger. What is surrounding the house? Sabrina made a deep, impatient sigh. Mayor Charming was rude and horrible, but he had a point. Mrs. Grimm wasn't a detective. She was just a busybody. This was a job for the police. Wait, I see something that looks wrong. The ground around the house is smashed down, Daphne said. Excellent eyes. And what could cause something like that to happen, Sabrina? I don't know. Are we going to sit here all day? Sabrina asked with a yawn. What do you think did it? So Daphne asked the old woman. A giant's foot, Mrs. Grimm answered. Find a giant beanstalk leaf and you'll probably find a giant. Daphne laughed, but Sabrina was horrified. First pixies and now giants. The old woman was getting crazier by the second. I'd better go down and have a closer look. If you find anything that seems like a clue, let me know, the old woman said as she climbed to her feet. She gingerly walked back down the hill and joined Mr. Kenneth at his pile. She's funny, Daphne giggled. In the head, Sabrina grumbled. She eyed the field, wondering if she and Daphne might be able to make a run for it right then and there. No, she didn't have a clue where they were. They could wander the woods that circled the farm for days and days. After their last trip into the woods, she wasn't eager for a return visit. She needed to get a better sense of the town and its roads before she and her sister could make another escape attempt. I want to ride it on the tractor, Daphne cried, leaping up and pulling her sister with her. They dragged Sabrina to the rusty red tractor and begged to be helped into the seat. Sabrina hoisted her up and Daphne grabbed the wheel and turned it, making vroom vroom noises as she pretended to drive. Look at me, I'm a farmer, she said in a goofy voice. Sabrina laughed and decided to play along. What kind of food do you grow on this here land, Farmer Grimm? Why, I grow candy on this here farm, Daphne laughed. Bushels and bushels of candy. Just sent my crop to market last week. Got me a pretty penny, I did. Sabrina smiled, even as a shadow drifted over her heart. Why had their mom and dad abandoned them? Didn't they realize the girls would be flung in every direction, never finding a place to call home, and forced to live with people who belonged in hospitals and prisons? Sure, Mrs. Grimm smiled a lot and made cookies and turned the day into an adventure with her make-believe, but that just made her the worst of the bunch. The security and dependability the older lady offered was tainted with crazy. She was like winning the lottery only to find out the money was counterfeit. Mrs. Grimm was the cruelest thing Miss Mutt had ever done. Sabrina, look at the house, Daphne whispered. The little girl had stopped playing and now stared at the pile below. What? What do you see? Sabrina studied the clearing but saw nothing new. Come up here. You have to see it from up here. Sabrina crawled up onto the tractor and stood tall on its hood. There! Look all around the pile. When Sabrina saw what her sister was so excited about, her heart leaped into her throat. The indentation around the rubble had a shape. It's a footprint, she gasped. Chapter 3. Sabrina was sure there was only one explanation for everything she and Daphne saw that day. She and her sister were the butts of some elaborate joke. Mrs. Grimm and Mr. Kent were trying to make them look like fools, explain why the old woman talked to the house and served her crazy food. It was why Mr. Kent nailed the window shut. This was some kind of twisted joke. When they got back to the house, Sabrina fully expected Mrs. Grimm to confess and reveal that she and Mr. and Candace were pulling a gag. Unfortunately, the prank kept going on when the old woman placed a weathered book in Sabrina's lap. It was called Grimm's Fairy Tales. So we've got a mystery on our hands, leadings, and a good detective starts every case by doing research. Sabrina handed the book back to the old woman. Okay, you've had your fun, she said. Don't you think we're a little old to fall for your jokes? You know, we're not dumb. We know there's no such thing as giants. Mrs. Grimm turned to Mr. Kenneth. It appears that Henry did not tell them, he said. When the old woman looked back at the girls, a crease formed between her eyes and her face went pale. No wonder the two of you have been looking at me like I'm Betty, she cried. What didn't Dad tell us? Daphne asked. Mrs. Grimm snatched the book from Sabrina and flipped through it like a maniac. This, she said as she shoved the book back into Sabrina's hands. She jabbed her finger at the portraits of two old men. Do you know who these men are? She asked. They didn't look familiar to Sabrina. Oh dear, Mrs. Grimm said. Girls, these men are Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They have a last name, Daphne said. That's because you're related to them, Liebling. Wilhelm was your great-great-great-great-grandfather, and with his brother Jacob, he wrote this book, said Mrs. Grimm as she pointed to the thinner of the two men. He had a large nose, tiny eyes, and long hair. People called them the Brothers Grimm. We're related to the fairy tale guys, Daphne cried. Yes, Libby, the fairy tale guys. But there's nothing in this book that's a fairy tale. These stories are their case files. The brothers were detectives, just like us. Every story in this book really happened. You might want to lie down, lady, Sabrina said. You're talking crazy again. I'm perfectly sane, Sabrina. Oh, how could Henry keep this from you? There's a whole family history you don't know anything about. All right, where do I start? Okay, back when Jacob and Wilhelm were alive or ever afters were still living among humans, Mrs. Grimm continued. Why ever afters? Daphne asked. That's what fairy tale creatures call themselves, and they can be quite touchy about it. After all, fairy tale creatures imply that they are monsters or animals. Most of them are human, or once were before a spell changed them. So, like I was saying, ever after still lived side by side with human beings. Back then, you really could find an ogre living under a bridge, or fairies in the forest, or knights fighting a dragon. For thousands of years, that was how everyone lived. Then things started to change. Humans grew afraid and suspicious of ever-afters. I blame the trolls. You can eat only so many peasants before people start to get nervous. Tensions grew. Violence swept the countryside, and laws were enacted that discriminated against ever-afters. Magic was made illegal, and dragons were captured and caged. Some ever-afters were run off the land or had their homes burned to the ground. Others were attacked in the streets, all because they were different. That's mean, Daphne said. Indeed, but people do terrible things when they're afraid. The brothers saw all of it happening and thought they could help. When something bad happened involving an ever after, they helped solve the crime, hoping to clear the accused ever after's name or to negotiate peace when the ever after was guilty. They wrote down everything they witnessed and collected cases that occurred hundreds of years before they were born, and they put them all in this book. It's a reference guide for the next generation of great detectives. Hardy ha ha, Sabrina said, holding the book out to the old woman. Even if what you are saying is true, which it isn't, how did all the ever afters get to America? It says here that these two dudes lived in Germany. Eventually, the brothers realized humans and ever-afters couldn't live together any longer, so they built ships and used their connections, and like generations of poor and persecuted people before them, the ever-afters decided to move to America. Yay! Daphne cheered. But America had its problems too, Mrs. Griffin explained. Boo! Daphne moaned. The brothers bought up almost 20,000 acres of rocky, unfarmable land on the Hudson River, the site of the future Port Landing, and with the help of some magic and some hard work, they transformed it into this beautiful town. Ever afters built homes and settled in, and when things were going well, they sent word back to Europe. More ever afters came, some from as far as China and Russia. They joined the growing community, and for a long time, everyone lived together in peace. That is, until humans started moving into Fairyport Landing. Uh-oh, Daphne said. Sabrina scowled. The woman's insane story had her sister listening with bated breath. So, as